All right, hey everyone. I'm going to go over the reteaching activity. I'm going to go question by question by question. If you should have already completed a good bit of this by now. If you have, make sure you still watch the video for the answers to that question. Just compare what you have to what I have. Make sure you're approximately or just about in the same ballpark. Okay. All right. Let's go ahead and dive on in. All right, so I'm going to go question by question. Let's go ahead and start with the first one. What is sectionalism? Sectionalism is basically loyalty to your region ahead of your country. All right. So the North was loyal to more the North than they were to the United States. The same for the South. How are these two things related? How is slavery and sectionalism related? Slavery became a sectionalist-based issue, an issue by which we could divide ourselves into different sections. So the North was against slavery, and then the South was obviously pro-slavery. That's why it was a sectionalist issue. How did slavery ultimately contribute to the start of the Civil War? Ultimately, everything leading into the Civil War can be linked back to slavery. So every single compromise that we talked about, the Dred Scott decision, this is all about slavery. Okay. So how did it contribute to the start of the Civil War? The Civil War, at its root, was a war over the question of slavery in America. Why did the South feel like their states' rights were being violated? The South felt that the North was threatening their state's right to slavery, to have slavery. Why did this push Southern secession, or the South to secede? They felt that their economic interests were threatened by Northern anti-slavery movements. All right, describe the North's economy in the early 1800s. Really, it's industrialized, so there's factories and stuff, manufacturing. The South's economy during the early 1800s is agrarian. It's based on agriculture. Why was the North in favor of higher tariffs? So higher tariffs on imported manufactured goods made American-made goods a more attractive option. So basically, if you have a plow from France that costs $10 and you have an equal quality plow from America that costs $20, you're going to buy the one from France because it's half as much. But what tariffs do is they make that French plow go from costing $10 to costing $20, $25, and therefore that $20 American-made plow all of a sudden becomes the better option for you. So the North was in favor of higher tariffs because it helped their manufacturing economy. Describe why South Carolina nullified the federal tariffs and the outcome of the nullification crisis of 1832. So South Carolina nullified the federal tariffs because it hurt South Carolina's economy. Andrew Jackson, being president, didn't like this. He called up the army. We nearly came to blows, but eventually a compromise was reached. The tariffs were lowered and both sides backed down. But fundamentally, it still left it as an open question whether or not a state was actually allowed to nullify federal law or not. Why was the spread of slavery into new territories such a dividing issue? Every single time a state needed to be granted, a territory went through the statehood process, it started a new crisis. So why was the spread of slavery such a dividing issue? Because as these new territories became states, it had the potential to throw the Senate out of balance between slave states and free states. Remember, it's about balance between free states and slave states in the Senate. That's what this is a fundamental issue over when it comes to the territories being admitted as states. What did each side gain out of the Compromise of 1850? To answer this question, I would encourage you to go take a look at your notes. Let's go ahead and do that now. So what did each side gain? We're going to look at what the North gained. The North got the slave trade banned in Washington, D.C. They had California come in as a free state. And the South, so this part, is going to get Texas coming in as a slave state. And they're going to get the passage of a stronger Fugitive Slave Act. Now, the other element you need to remember from the Compromise of 1850 is that Texas, when they came in, they gave up control of New Mexico and Utah, and then those two territories were granted popular sovereignty, the ability to choose for themselves whether or not they became free states or slave states once they were admitted into the Union. So that doesn't fit neatly in either one of these boxes, but it is an element of the Compromise of 1850 you need to know for the test. All right, how did the Georgia Platform delay the war? The Georgia Platform had the Georgia Platform convinced other southern states to accept the Compromise of 1850, delaying the start of the Civil War by 10 years. Okay. All right, next up. Who was Dred Scott? Dred Scott was a slave from Missouri who was taken north into free territory and then taken back into Missouri. Why did he sue the state of Missouri? He felt that his time in the free territories was enough to grant him his freedom. So he was suing for his freedom. What did the Supreme Court rule in his case? They ruled that Dred Scott does not have a right to basically sue for his freedom because he doesn't have, in general, African Americans, and this helps us answer the second question, are not citizens, therefore they don't have what's called standing to come before the courts. So the Supreme Court would rule that all the restrictions on the spread of slavery outside of one state, New York, were unconstitutional. They were a violation of an individual's property rights, seeing as, in their eyes, slaves were considered property. And then more generally, they decided that no black person, freed or enslaved, was allowed to be a citizen of the United States. All right, which political party did Abraham Lincoln represent during the election of 1860? The Republican Party. What platform did he run on during his campaign? He ran on a platform promising to prevent the spread of slavery. No, prevent the spread of slavery, not eliminate slavery, but just stop it from spreading to the territories. And his second promise was to keep the Union together. Why did the South secede immediately following the election of Abraham Lincoln? They didn't believe him. He may have not called himself an abolitionist, but all the abolitionists called him an abolitionist, and the South also believed that. And so ultimately they didn't trust Lincoln to keep his promise that he wouldn't, take actions to restrict slavery. Why were Georgia delegates divided on whether or not to secede from the Union? So basically, the way this broke down is that people who were more tied to the institution of slavery were more in favor of secession, while people who were not in favor of secession. So, for example, whites who lived in North Georgia, and this gets us here, they were largely poor farmers, not slave owners, and so initially they opposed secession, though they would eventually change their mind. Meanwhile, Southern slave owning, the plantation class, they very much supported secession and would ultimately, win the day, and Georgia would secede from the Union. So now we're getting into the stuff that's actually about the Civil War. What was the Union blockade? Basically, it's the Navy blocking off the ability of the South to trade its cotton for guns. Why did the Union think this would be a successful military strategy? Because the South doesn't have much of a significant manufacturing base. All right, so they had to trade their cotton for weapons. Otherwise, they wouldn't have the weapons to fight the war. The nickname that this plan was given was called the Anaconda Plan. An anaconda is a type of snake that kills its prey by choking it to death. And so the goal here was to choke off the South's economy. Was it ultimately successful? Yes, it was. There was actually bales of cotton found on the docks in Savannah that just couldn't be traded with Europe at the end of the day. What was the main message of the Emancipation Proclamation? So initially, the Emancipation Proclamation was about trying to get the South to surrender. So Lincoln said to them, if you surrender by January 1st, then you will be allowed to keep slavery. After that, though, when we conquer you, we will end slavery, where as it exists, we will free all the slaves. Did this document immediately achieve its desired results? So ultimately, Lincoln really did want us to free slaves. Did it immediately achieve this? No. slaves who lived in the 4 slave states that remained part of the Union. Nothing happened for them until the ratification of the 13th Amendment. And it would only free slaves in territories that had been captured by the Union Army, which was not a lot of the South at this time in the war. There's 2 positive outcomes overall, though. Ultimately, it does free, millions of slaves. And also, number 2, it allows African Americans to serve in the U.S. Army. All right, so let's go ahead and get over here to the Battle of Chickamauga. So you're going to give me the W's on it. Who? So this is the Union Army fighting the Confederate Army. What was it? It was the second deadliest battle of the Civil War. Where did it take place? In Georgia, just south of Chattanooga, Tennessee. Why did it occur? Because the Union had just captured Chattanooga and was chasing the Confederate Army, trying to capture it, or trying to break it, basically. And the Confederate General Bragg did this pretty crazy military maneuver where he swept his forces back around, kind of caught the Union Army by surprise, and ultimately that gets us to the outcome here. It was a significant Confederate victory. Now, at the end of the day, this is another part of the outcome, though. It only delays the Union's march into Georgia, right? It doesn't stop it. Like, eventually Sherman's coming, right? Which gets us to this next part. Why was Atlanta known as the heart of the Confederacy? It was one of the last remaining Deep South cities that had an industrial and transportation base. So it was a rail hub, the heart where all the veins come in. It was a railroad hub for the South, as well as a manufacturing facility, manufacturing city as well. One of the few that the South had. What strategy did Sherman use to take control of the city? Was it successful? Explain. He used what's called like a scorched earth or a total war strategy, where he basically views civilian assets as war assets, and he would ultimately destroy them, or he would take what he could and destroy what he couldn't take. Was it successful? I mean, that's up to you. I would say yes, because he captured Atlanta. What happened to Atlanta as Sherman was leaving? So as he's leaving on his march to the sea, Atlanta, his soldiers are going to burn. His soldiers are going to burn the city to the ground. Scorched earth policy he used on his march to the sea. Basically what I just said, he either takes what he can and then he burns what he can't take. Why did Sherman use his military strategy? To try to break the will of the South to fight and to punish the South for its rebellion. Explain how his policy is an example of total warfare. Basically, it views civilian and military resources as one and the same. Was Sherman March to the Sea success? That's up to you to decide. What were conditions like for Union soldiers at Andersonville prison? They were very bad. They were very undersupplied. They were treated poorly because of overcrowding, right? The prison was not designed to hold the amount of prisoners that it did. Captain Henry Wars, he was the commanding officer at Andersonville. Once the war ends, he'll be put on trial for war crimes and ultimately executed. All right, if you got any questions, let me know. I know I went a little faster that end part, but ultimately it's pretty straightforward stuff. Make sure you use your notes as you do this, and I will see y'all tomorrow. Bye.